Okay, we're now moving. The reason all that is so important, because that entire frame is what the person's parts, deep parts, their adult, everything believes. And so if the gospel is the power of God to salvation, at some stage some of that has to be dethroned in them. Otherwise they can't heal, because they can't actually accept themselves. So now we've got to talk about how we split up the neurological basis of that, what's in a memory island, what are the structures there, how it works, what are the flight-fight response structures, how we heal. It's just, you know, this should have been a week, but and I'm just trying to keep going. And what I've put down here is that we heal in relationship and we heal in community. And what I'd recommend for the people who aren't familiar with it, attachment theory, I think most of the therapists are familiar with, but attachment theory really defines the basis of the ache in your soul, right? You weren't loved properly. And a really good model I use is the thing called the circle of security. Is anybody familiar with it? You can look it up, circle of security, and do a search, and if not, I've got a PDF on my computer. And in essence, we're relational beings, and what we do is that all the fear structures are relational, and our problems go right back to our first relationship, sometimes beyond the womb, beyond birth. But as I'm coming back towards mum, as I'm coming back in, if mum's not open and I'm not open, I go through a structure in my mind called magical thinking. In that, I believe as a child I make everything happen. I'm not going to expand on that because we don't have time, but when I cry, I get fed, I make things happen by what I do. I'm in charge of the world, right? So as I come back to mum's not looking at me, dad's not looking at me, they're shut down. I've made this happen because it's all about me. I'm very powerful. I'm this universal child. What happens, I make happen. So I've made it happen. Mum doesn't love me. Dad not speaking to me, so it's about me. I've made this happen. And through a series of steps, it comes to circular thinking. And I've got a paper on that if you're interested, but it comes back down to, I'm not loved because I'm not good or bad, or, you know, some variation on that. And I'm not good because I'm not loved. And then part of them becomes trapped, and that trapping occurs in relationship. Now we can get into how parts work, and we can get into creatures that operate on those parts, and you can get lost in spirituality. And that's almost going back to Aristotle and escaping the body, right? I think we have to hold the whole thing together. And the most success I've had on the really traumatised people, and I say really traumatised, you know, the kids, the SRA kids, or the girls raped from 4 for years, and, you know, mess and X number of abortions, is actually getting them to work with their alive children on, when their child comes back, teaching them to recognise the child cues and to love them and to try and meet their needs. And then when the child goes out, to support their exploration. And then as the adult begins to work with the child, they begin changing. Their child becomes happy. They're getting life in a relationship, and they're also building a platform of truth. And in this platform of truth, they realise it's not about the child, it's about the adult, which provides the first frame in them that maybe it wasn't about me. Maybe, just maybe, it's not about me when I was younger. When they've got this absolutely locked belief, I'm bad because I'm not loved because I'm bad, in a different, and all the various rainbow colours you get of the circular thinking. So as we come back in towards the adult, they have this view, I'm bad because I'm not loved because I'm bad. I have fear. Fear takes off because fear is in the concept of relationship. As fear takes off, something happens in the brain. In the brain, there's a nucleus called the amygdala. And an American guy called Joseph, did all the work on this in the 90s, 1990s, a bit later than that. And they stuck needles into the amygdala, sheath needles, and just the tip exposed. And when you stick your needle into the amygdala, which is about here and about here on both sides of the brain, people had intense visions and feelings of heaven, hell, demons and angels, love and fear. Right? And the core of the human ties with the gospel, ties with what we're telling you on how we manage things, and this is relational love and relational fear. It's not independent from relationship. It's about survival. Survival is relational. And it's not about guilt. Guilt comes in only as far as we're not acceptable. Guilt can lock dissociation. So this structure here happens as the kid's coming back, and the kid, so we have intense feelings when they stick the needle into it, and they will also have visions and see things, and there's an element of hard wiring in the human, in some sort of structure about love and fear. Now, the amygdala is the beginning of the limbic system and takes messages up and down from the prefrontal area of the brain. Your left amygdala is continually scanning for content. Your right amygdala is looking at body language the whole time and other things. So you're looking verbal, non-verbal, content, non-content, right? Scanning everything. Is this safe? Is this non-safe? When things are coming to you that are unsafe, you don't let them go and be processed, and you don't let them be put in the filing system. You won't let them go into the filing system. And you will partition them, and you create things called memory islands or life experience islands. And you will partition this, and they'll have associations on them. Now, because we've partitioned them, and because they've come from fear, we are mammals. And the mammalian fear structure of freeze, flight, fight, and submission, which work on all mammals, then is operative on those memory islands. Now, this works in marriages. In most marriages, there's one partner who comes out and pursues, and there's one partner who withdraws. All marriage therapists know that, which is linked to the amygdala, about whether you move into flight or whether you move into fight. The flight people withdraw, the fight people pursue. Right? So how we function at our amygdala largely governs a lot of this. The freeze is manifest, we see in all anxiety in ourselves. You put yourself in a difficult situation and you watch your breathing. You don't breathe. Right? You little pants. Watch your clients. The moment they stop breathing, recognise that they're instantly into the mammalian freeze response from their amygdala. Recognise that, because fear is the door to the memory island. Now, having said this, I don't believe that you should be charging through doors of defences and ripping down and trying to re-traumatise people. I don't believe that. I think what you should be doing is building structures that enable strength. You have to teach people about attachment. You have to teach people about relationships and how it works. You teach them with their children, how to love their children, and how to say goodbye to their children, and how to grow a foundation of relationship, because the Trinity is relationship, grow a foundation of relationship in their lives. They then move to a position where they can see their magical thinking as an adult. They move to a position where they can see how they are still attached to their perpetrator. Right? They then grow, and as you teach them to grieve, and you introduce the capacity for grief, because the human life is riddled with grief. Everything you know will pass away. If you live long enough, everyone you know will die. This thing's set up for grief. And the people who are traumatised don't know how to grieve either. So you have to teach them how to grieve. You have to give them life strengths and life skills. So they've got to learn about grief. They've got to learn about attachment without all the big words. They've got to learn about magical thinking. They've got to learn and see that their attachment to their perpetrator can be fixed. And then in relationship structures, they've got to learn what a person is. And so you've got to whiz them through the victim, rescue, abuser structure because they're always functioning with disordered responsibilities. Disordered responsibilities, the victim is always responsible for what everybody else does. The abuser is never responsible for what they do. And the rescuer picks up everybody else's responsibilities. Now, we all have that sickness to a point in all of us, a different colour, right? But if you can teach them those processes on the way through, you can start to build something positive in relationships, and we discover that healing begins to occur in community, right? Which is why I believe churches and communities are so important. Now, having said that, we now move in, and I'm not having said that and pushed that because I'm not here to teach you on attachment. You can look that up. Look up the circle of security. Look up the way. I'll just act it out for you. Ness says no. Come and stand here, Ness. Right? Just stand there, right? Ness is my mum, right? As I'm coming back into mum just gets shut down. Mum's depressed, not coping. Maybe mum's never been raised herself, doesn't know what to do, right? As I'm coming back into mum's not there. Oh, she's not happy with me. Oh, I've made this happen. Oh, she doesn't love me because I'm not good. I'm not good because she doesn't love me. Oh, and then I almost turn in on myself and I come back and I'm really wanting her to organise my feelings. I'm really wanting her to delight in me, love me and encourage me and all that stuff. But I shut off, I become avoidant. And then when I come back and sit with mum, I sort of sit here and the level of communion I've got is like that. Tiny communion. And I see marriages like this the whole time. I watch partners come into their partner and then I watch them wrap around, shut down, and they sit there as adults going, it's like two zombies looking straight ahead. And the level of union in the marriage is so tiny, and they say, we've got a good marriage. We never fight. And there's no true soul union. The hardest thing, because we've all been patterned in that, the coming in, and we've all shut down to a portion, right? So as a therapist, you're going to have to work on yourself as you do this. We'll get someone to help you. The hardest thing is to come back in and stay open. To stay open and not shut down, and then not trigger out of the pain that causes, but to say, hang on, are you there? Can we relate? Okay, you need some space, but not let them off, not play the avoidant game, right? And not act badly. Really hard yards. And it's what we're all called to. We're all called to decent relationships. Right? If Jesus is the Lamb of God who's taken away the sins of the world, I believe the church should be teaching people how to love each other, how to truly relate, instead of focusing on sin. Sin's been dealt with. Right? Now, as I come in and I spend time with mum, and then I'm leaving and I've only had this much union. So when I go, I'm now ambivalent about going. So I go, oh, I don't want to go, mum. And I send messages, cues to mum saying, I don't want to leave. I want to go, don't want to go. Right? And then if mum's sick, so I'll come back, darling, it just becomes sick. And then I'm not able to go out and explore. And what we do, we start as kids, our primary relationship with his mum, we go out a tiny bit and we come back a tiny bit. And that circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger until I stand here as an adult myself with my children going out from me. And the process of patterning, which is like ducks and geese and all other mammals, this basic relational process we've got, we don't even know what we're doing, we've got from our parents, is patterned into us. It's so primal. And if you sit and look at yourself, it's horrifying. Right? So, having said that, this is the primal thing. Now, if you teach people how to improve that with their children, their sense of joy, healing occurs in community, not just the therapist's office. I'm not kicking therapists. I'm saying our focus is not ourselves, but building community. As we build community, they've got something to operate in. Thanks, Ness. Is that clear? Right. So that's then, you've already got your gospel underway. You're going to have you've got meaning underway, you've got relationships. Now we're going to come back and assuming you're running your attachment stuff, right? Assuming that you've got that running, you've taught them how to grieve, they deal with their magical thinking, they go have their epiphany, and however that happens, through prayer, through work with them, through work with their children, they come to this realisation, I was a kid. However that happens, right? And it's not about me. It was about mum and dad. They were stuffed. Well, welcome to the human race. You know, this is how it works. So if you can get them that far, that's great. But then the things I want to talk of, because we don't have much time left now, is I want to talk about how the amygdala relates with the memory island to give you some of the structures that occur there and how that relates further. Because what happens with hypnosis and what happens with mind control, you know, the governmental mind control stuff that goes on, that's all built around this structure, which is how we are built. Now, a little bit of history. In the 1800s, late 1800s, a guy called Pierre Janet, who was working with dissociation. They didn't call it dissociation. I think he might have called it dissociation. And he did a lot of things where he understood that people reduced their consciousness to cope with things. And he also understood the rest of the consciousness went in. So there was a conscious consciousness and an unconscious consciousness. And he realised what was going on in the human. And they understood dissociation. Out of that, they understood hypnosis. World War I, World War II, all governments were running hypnotic couriers. They would hypnotise people and a businessman would go from one town to another and he'd be unlocked by the military person there and he'd be transferring information, right? Freud's stuff was coming up. World War II, they were still doing mind control and hypnosis for military purposes, except by World War II they were learning how to break it, so learning how to break into each other's couriers through use of drugs, mescaline and different basically mind-altering drugs to break, you know, half-dose thiopental, to get truth serum and things, to try and break up the dissociative structures, to get avenue to what was meant to be locked. Into this realm comes Freud's stuff. Now Freud made a fatal mistake. He was a really good enthusiast, but he was doing work on girls of part of the Vienna Circle. So Freud presented his early work, or not early, some of his major work to the Vienna Circle on what he saw, and he was presenting actually the results of sexual abuse from his peers. I think he lacked a frontal lobe. And he got ostracised. And then he altered it, right, to that what the girl's looking for is love. And so a lot of the stuff is a guy called Masson, M-A-S-O-N, who was a therapist in the States. He's a Jewish guy. He's a linguist, speaks 12 languages, and he became a therapist. And having become a therapist, he then thought he would go and learn German. It didn't take him long, 3 months, because he's a linguist, German linguist. And he was a professor of Sanskrit before that. So he's, you know, he's not a dumb man. And he thought he'd go and learn German, which he did, and then he translated the complete letters of Freud to Fliess, Fliess being Freud's mate, which presented an entirely different view of what therapy is. And as a consequence, he was struck off as a therapist. His sin was translating the complete letters of Freud to Fliess. Having translated the complete letters, it undid a lot of what they call therapy. Right? Now, the military have not been at all worried by this ever since. The military are extremely pragmatic and they press on. They're not interested in whether something's right or wrong, they're interested in whether something's worked. So we have a real problem in there. Psychiatry at the moment has got itself locked up a cul-de-sac. We know that a human is primarily relational. I was chatting about this with a professor of psychiatry in Australia, and I was saying to him, I'm myself almost 50 and he's 55 or 56. I said, have you ever had pain in your life? I won't mention his name. And he goes, yes. And I said, was it relational? And we started laughing about it, how the deepest pains in people's life are primarily relational. And that the DSM-4 structure that we've got for mental health has no primary axis for relationship. Not one. Talk about, you know, we've talked about the influence of Aristotle, Plato, and you could get into Descartes and the influence upon our society that we don't even have a relationship as a structure within psychiatry. What's going on? You with me? This is just horrendous. Now, psychiatrists themselves understand relationships is important, but it should be at the foundation of all our teaching. It should be built on and taken further forward. Now, the DSM-4 structure has a problem of what we call comorbidity. That is, hop up, Ness, right? If I take Ness and I traumatise her, right, in relationship to something, and then I measure her responses over a period of time, she will have a whole series of different DSM categories over her life. In fact, it will go up and down, right? At some stage, she'll have an anxiety phobia because of red cars, because I tried to run over with a red car or something. You know what I mean? Like, it will build, and then she'll have fear of something else, and then she'll get anxious, and then she'll have depression. And so her diagnostic structures, allegedly diagnostic structures, increase. So we have a problem of comorbidity. We have more than one diagnosis. Now, sit down, Ness. Medicine was at this stage a couple of 100 years ago with fevers. We used to have quartern fevers, tertian fevers, all sorts of fevers, until someone discovered germs. When we discovered germs, the whole thing flipped, and the diagnosis stayed the same. So when you had scarlet fever, you get a fever, it go up and down, you get a rash, you get certain things, but there was a profile that occurred with fluctuating symptoms during one disease. What we're measuring principally in psychiatry is symptoms, not primary causes, right? And there's a debate occurring in Western psychiatry where this is emerging. And I've already seen the people starting to write papers, the problems of comorbidity in psychiatry. What we've got is a problem arising. We have a major problem arising. Can you see what I'm talking about? Now, as we move into the fact that we're relational beings, relationship will come back to the heart of the understanding. The primary relationship we're going to come back, which is the attachment structure between a parent and a child. Because most of our pain and patterning comes out of those structures. So psychiatry has a long way to go. On the contrary, the military have progressed with their mind control programs, and they now understand that we are mammals, just like chickens, and we're highly hypnotisable, highly programmable, and we're not gods that we think we are from Greek medicine, right? And so the military and the CIA and the various agencies need mind control because all of the rogue governments have mind control. So I'm not against mind control being in operation, but I am against mind control being used on civilians, especially for experimentation. And there's been some books put out that by American psychiatrists now who've been involved in the victims of US mind control, which goes on. A guy called Colin Ross, amongst others, have put out books. He put out a book called Bluebird, which has been rebadged. The fact that Colin's alive, I think, is a major thing, but also an indication of the tolerance within the US society and the CIA, which is great. Because he's not against the CIA or their mind control programs, he's just against the bad use of it. You do need, in a difficult world, the technology in these areas to be on the side of the non-totalitarian governments. You do. And so I'm not against these things. I'm saying that they shouldn't be used on civilians, right? Now the clue is, why have I digressed into something politically of intrigue and, you know, the conspiracists over here jumping up and down, you know? Why have I done that? To say that psychiatry is in a cul-de-sac and the military is not. The military is pragmatic. If it works, we use it. Do more research. Psychiatry and psychology depends on personalities and allegiance to ideas. And we've been caught in all sorts of traps. Now, the principal thing that I want to take you through is that this amygdala structure is the core of how the programming occurs. Right? This is the core of how we function. This is the core. We pivot out of flight or fight, out of love or fear. Love or fear. If we get into fear, we can induce dissociation. If you can induce dissociation, if it remains there, over time, it can become a part of the person. Right? The next thing, if it becomes a part of the person and you've got a dissociative structure, for some reason, once you're dissociative, and listen to this very carefully, once you're dissociative, it seems that then you can become influenced by other things. I say other things, that is, other non-physical entities. Right? And so all therapists at some stage who have a Christian belief structure seem to come across other things inside people. Right? And the thing is, as you deal with these other things, it seems to occur from the flight-fight structure. Now, we don't go charging into those areas. The first thing you do is build stability within the person, teach the person how to live. Right? Teach the person they're loved, make them strong, and then they have a place by which they can embrace their fear. The door into those places is always fear. It's always an uncomfortable entry. Now, having said that, I don't believe in re-traumatizing people, because if Jesus has gone to the bottom of the sewage pit, who's on the other side of their parts? Christ. Now, as you work with Christ, He will give you your methods, and I'll tell you about some that work with some of our people. But I'm just getting prompted to talk about, before I do that, talk about how the creatures work, right? I don't use the word demons, right? I don't use the word demons because Hollywood has taken over the meaning associated with that word, right? If you say demon, people envisage something that doesn't exist, right? All I can say is that we know certain things. What do we know? We know that if a person goes and sleeps with a, say, prostitute or engages in illicit, bad, lustful sex, a person who's never been that way may thereafter be driven by a drive that they can't explain. The next thing that happens, that person may sleep with someone else who then also has this drive, right? Everybody familiar with that? Anybody not familiar with that concept, right? Any problems? Okay. The next thing is ask questions. If it's demons, are demons multiplying? Are they having children? What's actually going on here? Because people just, I heard people say, oh yeah, that you passed on another demon. So what have we got? We've got repositories of these things somewhere? Something's going on that doesn't make sense. Because the population's increasing. Oh, these are those who are before, before the flood. No, it doesn't make sense, right? So what I'm postulating to you that is whatever is working here is a process of light and darkness. And it's working through what we call in physics non-locality. And it doesn't matter where you are, you sort of open up your being to something on the non-locality principle. You're sharing the desires of whatever that thing is. And whatever happens in the prayer process, you're closing the capacity for the interpenetration or the perichoresis of that darkness with that person, and the drive goes. Does that sort of make sense? Some blank looks. If you look up non-locality in physics, that's really, I think there's going to be physics undergirding all of the stuff that we do, because the universe is physical. Magic is merely taking the things of the universe and pulling strings to make things happen, right? So there's going to be underlying structures to what happens. Now the next thing you find is, as in tribal cultures and in witchcraft, where there's inherited stuff coming through, and the next thing is inherited stuff coming through, it's like they've got ancestors in them, but these don't multiply because one person is chosen and then it's transferred into that person before they die, right? It's almost like keeping the tribe together stuff, right? Now, that thing that works, there's no multiplication there, but it's like a continuation of the ancestors. You with me? So you've got something which seems to multiply, and you've got something which operates through lineage. The next thing you've got is you've got hereditary problems, right? And hereditary problems which seem to come down, and they seem to have the capacity to come out like a tree and multiply down through the generations, which is different again. So if you apply, I'm not saying I've got this right, I'm saying I'm just trying to apply thought to what you meet, right? So you're just trying to think and make sense of it. You've got the stuff which seems to work by non-locality, that is, it seems to multiply, so it can't be happening, it must be operating through a different principle. You've got the stuff which is direct transfer, logical, and you've got the stuff which seems to come out through the generations like a tree, right? The stuff that comes out through the generations like a tree, people misquote Exodus 34. And what they do, they misquote the name of God to say God's a bastard. I'm not in Australia, am I? I'm really sorry, guys. You're going to have to edit that out. I've been so good all week. Whoa. Wow. Okay, so Exodus 34, verse 6. The name of the Lord God, merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. That's a definition of sin. Iniquity is saying, stuff you, God. Transgression is crossing a boundary, and sin is failing to hit the mark. So, forgives the lot. You know, you try hard, you miss. You deliberately cross the boundary, or you say, stuff you, God, that's iniquity. This is 3 definitions, right? All are forgiven. Forgiving iniquity, transgression, sin. Abounding in truth. Keeping mercy for thousands. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation. So people jump in here and say, see, there's a legal basis for transference of inherited sin. And I was going, yeah, but it's 3rd and 4th generation. Everybody working here has met stuff that's going back a long way. What's going on here? And when you track back through family records, it goes back for more than 3 or 4 generations. Right? This verse is not to be used as the basis for hereditary sin, because that's actually saying that God curses, after saying God forgives. So it says on one hand, God thoroughly forgives iniquity, transgression and sin, and on the other hand, he starts cursing. This is this dodgy gospel stuff coming through. What it's really saying is it's saying, I forgive, and by I'm going to visit the iniquity of the fathers to the children and the children's children. Okay, stand up, Ness. Ness is going to be a father, right? This father is full of iniquity, and he's going to blind the face of God to his ancestors. And God says, I'm going to forgive you, but I'm going to visit your iniquity in your children so they will know me to the 3rd and 4th generation. I'm going to visit your children and your iniquity on them, and they're going to be confronted by me despite you, because you are not going to lock out your children from my face. Go and have a look at it, pull the words apart. It doesn't mean what we've been taught as a legal basis for hereditary stuff. It's a declaration of the name of God, not a declaration of cursing. Right? So please just unpack Exodus 34 and have a look at it yourself. Now, with the stuff coming down through the generations, all the stuff that's going on with witchcraft and witches and all the stuff, and they do have paths which I don't understand, and I've been down that path and had witches in my house and done the whole deal, which we all make a mess of. They do. The victory comes back to what we spoke of before. When Jesus died, we died, they died, everything died, and when Jesus rose, so did we. So don't get caught up into chasing back into names of demons, structures, and chasing it through. Major on Christ, not jumping onto the football field to play a dualism game. Right? Now, having said that, now we have to sort of talk about then what you do when you come across seemingly human spirits inside somebody who's dissociative. Now, the first thing to say is that the fragmentation of a person, which occurs through fear and seems to be what these things want, because that enables them to stay there. I don't think they're particularly nasty. They often think they're doing a good job. But with your amygdala, your stream of information's coming in, all your life streams coming in, the size of an almond, and it's meant to go out through the hippocampus to the caudate nucleus and then somehow be stored through the brain. And we don't know how that storage occurs, and I don't think we've got the concepts to understand it yet. But we seem to peel off a memory island. And the moment you peel off a memory island which may progress through to being a part, which is fear-based, always fear-based, doesn't operate without fear. There is some fear. Remember, fear is to do with survival, and fear is relational. It's not just, I'm going to make you scared. It's to do with always to do with relationship. As you peel off this fear, and it may come through to being a part, this allows the interaction of the person with other things. Right? It allows somehow other non-physical interaction. It would seem that some of the mind control programs that have been operating down the years have run into trouble here with what we call creatures. Okay? So as you get that, you meet what we would regard as souls. Don't know if that's the correct term. Some seemingly human things, generational things in different format that's come through people. What you meet what you'll call hybrid structures, and that seems to be what they call the non-dead. And you meet other, all I can call them is creatures. There seems to be a thing that exists called a watchers, and watchers seem to just stare at things and induce fear to maintain the dissociation. Now,
this is all from clinical sort of observation group?
This is just, all I can say, this seems to be from experience. And then we've got this so-called the drive thing, which is the multiplication thing. These things here can be hereditary, coming down in the triangle, or the drive can be hereditary, or these are coming down in a linear fashion. Now, I don't understand how this whole thing works. I've got a lot more structures which I've developed over the years trying to look at it and understand it. But what I've come down to is you actually don't have to understand it. Right? And you're not called to. And the Bible doesn't major on it because we're not meant to. Now, what I've learned is if you start looking for darkness, you'll start seeing darkness. And the more you look for darkness, the more you'll see. And we're actually meant to major on love, life and light, not meant to be majoring on darkness. So whatever's going on here, the only reason I draw this is that you end up with a strange situation where Jesus went down in Peter and he proclaimed to those who are dead the gospel. And we know he rose, leading captivity captive. So the dead he proclaimed to were the pre-Diluvian dead in Peter. Right? Ephesians says, who is he who ascended but he who first descended into the very parts of the earth? And then Peter says, being made alive in the Spirit, he first went and preached to the imprisoned spirits. These were those who hadn't obeyed God in the days of Noah. Right? So we know that whatever Christ did between his death and when he physically resurrected, he led captivity captive. He went down, having swallowed the power of death, and he proclaimed to the captives. And those who wanted to follow him could follow him. Right? Which means that anybody left in whatever that spiritual world is doesn't have an idea of anything. Doesn't know what the truth is. Anybody left behind didn't go with the Saviour. Which of course makes mediums a waste of time. Have I lost you on that point? You got it? If mediums are tapping into the world of the dead, if Christ went down and cleaned out the world of the dead and said, I'm the Saviour, and ascended with captivity captive, all those left behind have rejected Christ. They don't know which way's up. So it's a waste of time. So the next thing is when you come across these things, I used to do things like cast them out. And that's really good fun, of course, because you don't know if you're dealing with a part. You can't cast parts out. And then we used to send them to places. So what I do now is I preach the gospel to them. Because that's the only thing we were given permission for. It's really funny. I tell you, it's really funny. People are very happy me chasing into all sorts of details about this and getting lost down rabbit warrens, and people are very happy me getting involved with blood and water and you name it, and everything under the sun. But the moment you say, I'm going to proclaim Christ into this, everybody starts running for cover. What's going on here? And so what I've learnt to do, I say, when God became human in Jesus Christ, he joined to the whole human race. And when he died, you died, and when he rose, you rose. I'm not sure what you're doing here. I'm not sure what you're trying to achieve. I'm not sure whether you're locked here because of some sort of covenant or curse or ritual that was performed back in history. But if that's true, you too have died in Christ, and you too have risen in Christ, and any law holding you is also broken. So you've got to deal with a connection back in history and proclaim the gospel over that, so they're freed from that. You preach to whatever you're meeting and tell them it's now freed. And then you say, you can step inside Christ who you can see, and often they end up seeing him. And it seems universal, and I don't understand why, but he often appears with outstretched arms. Anybody notice that? Which is like, it's the body language of openness and receptivity. And I say, what can you see? I can see with his arms outstretched. Can you trust him? After you go, step inside him and go home, or go and wander where he lets you wander, but you're not allowed to stay here anymore. So you end up not fighting evil on evil's terms, but you end up rolling out the gospel into places and dimensions where the gospel has to be rolled out into. Does this make sense? Right. So what I'm saying is there seems to be hybrid creatures, and I don't know if that's true. That seems like the Nephilim sort of stuff. And they seem to be able to traverse different dimensions, and that's where the whole astral crap comes in. And creatures. So, there's all this, people get really fancy about it, and I've got this special secret Gnostic knowledge, right? The issue is, you are going to meet inside a person something that's the person, and maybe something that's not the person. It may be independent of the part, or it may be attached to the part because of legal sort of behaviourogram stuff, right? The aim of all these things is to maintain the dissociation so they can stay. It's like having a jigsaw puzzle, removing a piece or two and dropping some foreign pieces in. You can never get the thing back together. And that's their aim. Yep.
So how would you work that backwards to what would the healed version look like from that diagram?
Well, if it was healed back, these would be gone from the person, and this memory island part would be reintegrated back with the restored memory, and the memory would be merely historical memory, not traumatic memory. So their memory structure is such that I don't jerk and shake and shudder, and I can remember, yeah, I was raped, it was very uncomfortable, but they're not reliving it. They can remember walking through it. Now, the process of that, so we'll just run into memory islands. Now, the process of seeing it healed, like one of our therapists, she's really good in the sense that what she does, she doesn't make any presumptions or things. She spends time helping people know Christ, right? And we're not talking the dodgy gospel, but Jesus Christ. And once they know Jesus at some point, she'll just be saying, Jesus, what do you want to do? And often it's nothing, because we've got this desire to get people fixed. We've got this desire to do it now. And Christ's got a different agenda and structure. Christ's currency is relationships and personhood. We seem to operate out of fear and guilt to get someone fixed. We've got to get them better. Christ seems very relaxed. Right? And so she just asks, things happen like, and you've probably all had this, the trauma is put up on a video screen and the person watches it from a distance. All sorts of things happen. Another thing happened, Jesus pulls the screen down so the person can't see, and he just goes in himself and he picks up the parts, cleans them up, sorts them out, and the person, all sorts of infinite variations happen. For the really bad SRA victims, the really bad SRA victims, it would seem that he fixes them up on his own. Every time I've tried to get my fingers in there, I end up re-traumatising the person. You know, you understand what re-trauma? They end up reliving the shocking memories. Now, as far as memories go, question?
Well, I was just wondering what you do when that, like, I'm seeing that word. But what about when a part, you know, there's 50 parts and there's 2 holdout who don't want to know Jesus, they don't trust Jesus, they've had some lies told them about Jesus, but they also have things, hybrids or creatures that hassle them, that shut their ears so they can't hear anything, whatever, and they just...
Okay, the question for the tape is, what do you do when you've got parts which are being blocked by evil from hearing the gospel? Hang on, that's all that evil does. That's when you say, in the name of Jesus, you're not allowed to do this.
Yeah.
So if you've got something that doesn't want to listen to the gospel, that's providing blackness and darkness to the person's part, so they're living in darkness and the light is shining through them, but they can't comprehend or understand it. We have to participate with the light. And in the name of Jesus, we do not permit it. Yeah.
That settles it in your experience?
Yeah. Well, I try not to actively make decisions of my will involved with another person. I try and stay back, because when you're younger, you try and fix everything up. You know, they say medicine, you know, the first part of your life, you're just trying to, you know, change everybody and fix everybody. And the next part of, you're just trying to save them from themselves. And the last part of your career, you're trying to save yourselves from them. I heard an old doctor say that to me. I thought, pretty close. You know, as you get older and wiser, you realise you've got boundaries on what you're meant to be doing, and you've got to stay within those. You don't get in and you just try and obey Christ in what you're doing. Yep. Question?
That's what happens when the fragment itself doesn't want to receive it.
When the if the fragment's blind and can't see Christ, that's fine. But see, that's what the role of the Spirit is, what the role of prayer is, and the issue is, if you're building the adult in a relational structure, right, you'll find the child will come back far more easily. Because when they come back, they're not accused. The adult doesn't feel bad about them. Now, I was going to head into memory islands and what we find in a memory island. I've skipped over that really quickly. You know, people are looking at me, not giving nods. There's just so much more in there. But at the end of the day, I actually don't think you can teach people this area. I think it's more important that you know the gospel and what not to do. And then when you get there, if you know obedience to Christ yourself, and then if I teach you the structures of how the brain works, then you can make sense of what you're meeting. Right?
Yes.
And then how to get that better, right, is always the gospel. It's like someone said to me yesterday, he said, you know, in Sunday school the answer was always Jesus. So he said, when I was asked what's small and furry with a long furry tail, he said, I was going to say squirrel, but I said Jesus, you know. So what's in a memory island? I'll call it a life experience island. What's in this life experience island that's been peeled away? Now, just to let you know, they're not just soul concepts. We've spoken about the soul and the body being one. The guy did some work in Australia about 4 years ago, and they did high resolution EEGs. And when the person was dissociated, they had age-related EEGs when the parts are up. So it does manifest through whatever the body is. It's not just soul spooky stuff. This is going to be integrated. You with me? It's going to be the whole person integrated. Now, how many guys of you have been to family reunions? You just had your Thanksgiving and you sit around the table with your family and your brother or sister or parent say something and then all sorts of emotions erupt in you that you thought you'd got rid of and suppressed, right? And if you can understand that process, that's your door into memory islands. You have emotional parts of yourself that you haven't managed to heal and haven't been able to heal, and they have triggers on them. And when they play, and we do our best to shut them down. Now the clue about a memory island is that when you activate it, it will play just at the memory stage. If it hasn't developed into a person, it will play like a tape. And this is how you differentiate. I don't trust visual memories at all, but memories in the body are very interesting. So memory islands will play in the body. And it doesn't seem that the body lies, it seems that our imagination or reconstruction can lie, right? But when it plays in the body, it doesn't lie, and it will play the same way, the same time, every time. It's like pressing start on a piece of tape. It just plays, and the person goes through it again. Now, this thing always has, if it's got enough information, it has a story to tell, and you've got to try and get its story out of it. Now, the attributes of the memory island there's going to be serious emotion. The emotion that you have when you're a 3-year-old and you have overwhelming terror as a 3-year-old or 1-year-old or a child, when that manifests in a 35-year-old's body with the same level of overwhelming emotion, it's paralysing. You just play that. A 3-year-old or 1-year-old, overwhelming emotion, when it triggers in the adult, it's totally overwhelming. So they suffer this overwhelming emotion, right? It may be at an age. It may be age expressed, locked at an age, right? It will usually have the mammalian trauma response of fear. It'll be in some sort of freeze, or it'll be a flight, or it'll be fight, or it'll be submission. There may be pain or other sensations in the island, physical pain or sensations. There may be spoken commands or programs. You can call them programs, which are the same as hypnosis. You must do certain things, right? And they may have, in many ways, a body memory. Now, when you're working with a person, if you watch carefully, you will watch the change in their face and the change in their breathing and the change in how they work. So as a therapist, it's not really possible for someone to heal while you keep triggering fear. Fear and love, fear and love. If we could just drive this into the church. Fear and love, fear and love, fear and love. There's only 2 languages, fear and love. Right? People can't heal when they're hypervigilant. Right? Fear and love, fear and love. This is why, it doesn't matter which method of therapy you look at, it seems that it's the issue of connection and the capacity of the therapist is more important than anything else. Why? Perhaps some therapists can actually make people feel loved. Right? So, you have that running in the memory island. Now, the other thing that goes on is we've said we are a meaning machine. We attach meaning to everything. Does anybody here not attach meaning to things? What do you do when a series of things go wrong? Your bank card crashes, the machine does something, something else happens, and people say, the meaning, God's against me, or the devil's, people attach meaning. We can't help ourselves. We attach meaning to things. So we start attaching really serious meaning to something, and the meaning again is going to be age-related. How sensible is that going to be? There's going to be age-related meaning attached to it. And we're going to come back here. I'm coming back to Mum. I'm bad because I'm not loved. I'm not loved because I'm bad. So you start finding circular meaning. Anybody here started talking with parts and found them going in circles? Yes, no? So you find they get trapped in these meaning issues because we're a meaning machine, and the meaning is related to the age, and it's often circular, and it often means they're bad. Now, the other clue that you find in these things, you find if it's had enough time to be a decent part, you might find vows or promises. I will never. We've spoken about commands. If they've been hurt by somebody, they've been told that they must never tell anybody about what's going on, or your mother will die, or something like that. And so, even though they're 45, they can't talk about the time the man raped them, because they've got this inherent belief that the moment I do, Mum's going to die, which is totally illogical, but it's believed, and they take very active moves to make sure they're going to keep Mum alive by not speaking. Right? So all of those sort of things operate. There's vows and promises. There may be deep sense of injustice, and you may have to help them process injustice and bitterness. And you might find, and this is very important, you might find there is suppression of the normal fight response. And in fact, some of the work that I do with people, not that I'm working this way at the moment because I haven't worked actively for a number of months, I've jumped out of it for a number of reasons at the moment, but when you're getting people who are locked down, one of the things you do is that the parts freeze, flight, fight, submission, you find usually a frozen or submission part, and the thing missing in the person's life is the capacity to fight. Right? So you start with your mammalian, freeze, flight, fight, submission. That's what we've got. For some reason, the fight part seems to be horribly deficient, and it seems they're not allowed to fight. For whatever reason, if you look at the boundaries in these people's life, they've almost got no boundaries. And so one of the things I do is I take a card or something, I find something the person doesn't like, and I take a card and draw an ugly face on it or something very simple schematic, and I walk towards the person like this. They know I'm going to do it. And you know what they do? They sit there, they go, and they won't even knock the card away. So I spend a lot of my time trying to build their defences, trying to build their platforms of life, not just removing evil. Remember, evil is not an entity. It's non-being. Life, light, and love is what we're on about. Evil, it's not like good and evil. Evil is just darkness that's ultimately non-being. So you focus on the positive. So you've got to hit this away now, Ness. You teach them as they come in that they're to hit it away. And you start teaching them. And the agony they go through, just trying to push a card away. You get them to gradually get till they get angry and they slap it. You cheer them, yeah, good shot. So you build their defences in all different ways because they've lost the fight response. Why? I don't know. It's almost like when I'm being raped, I've made a vow or decision. I know if I fight, I'll get killed. I'm not allowed to fight. So, often you don't find out why, but it's like they've made that internal decision they're not going to fight for their own survival. And as a consequence, when they go through life, they have no capacity to fight. And you need to be able to fight. My son was getting bullied at school, and so went to the behaviour management thing, nothing. Went to the teacher, nothing. So I bought him, he was only a little tacker, he was only grade 3, grade 4. I bought him an adult-sized punching bag, and I taught him how to hit it and move his hips and lock his wrists. My wife was horrified. And all the Christians said, he's got to turn the other cheek, which is a misquote. Go and get Walter Wink's study of turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, and give him your coat. It says the opposite. It says the opposite to how the Western Church interprets. Go the extra mile was to get the Roman soldier in trouble. You could carry his pack 1 mile. If you took it 2, you could take him before the legal authorities. Jesus was saying, if you're fighting an unjust oppressor, use the laws of the land against him. It was non-violence opposition of evil. The second one was turn the other cheek, and it was, if you're getting a backhanded slap, it had 2 associations with it. One is that you turn up and say, now do it again and be responsible for you. And the other context was up into the gates of the city, do it again in front of witnesses. So it's calling people to account for their actions. And they give him your shirt, he's taken your house, he's taken your land, he's taken your money, he's taken your coat. Jesus says, take off your shirt, which is all they had, their undershirt, give it to him and stand naked and shame him. Shame his humanity. It's not an institution of victimisation for Christianity. It's a non-violent opposition of evil. So when I taught my son to fight, he eventually got bullied again, and he flattened the perpetrator. We were just, hit him once, he didn't come back. My son later, he came back and he said, Dad, they're going to get me. He's grade 6 at that stage. He said, some boys want to get me, and there's a gang of them. And so I said, son, if you land on the ground, they'll kick you really badly. He said, don't go there. Work out who's the ringleader. When you know it's on, and he's stepping into you, step forward, take out the ringleader, and then run out of there. And he did. You've got to teach your kids to fight, to survive the world, right? And these parts of the people have the fight response has been blocked, and they're not allowed to fight, and they get into terrible trouble. And I know some ladies here who've been through some difficulties are nodding furiously, And I think that what actually happens is that during the trauma they go through, they make a decision to survive, and they say, "I'm going to survive. I will not fight." Now, the next thing is the so-called Stockholm Syndrome, or attachment to the perpetrator. If you look up the Stockholm Syndrome, you'll find that people who've been through hostage situations ending up being attached to the people in charge of the situation. You find kids who've been through a rape process and traumatising process end up being attached to the perpetrator. It seems that this attachment process is so deep in us that you can have an abnormal attachment to the perpetrator, and that has to be dealt with. And part of dealing with it is helping the adult grow their own platforms and then bringing light to bear on the part. But attachment to the perpetrator has to be broken. The next thing is religious structures. Religious structures such as fear, guilt, conscience, rejection, all of those things actually stop healing. So all the stuff we did today and we spoke through, if the adult's carrying that stuff, they won't ever be able to cope with their parts. So most of this stuff you're doing with the adult won't be able to cope with the parts. You're not going to get anywhere because they keep pushing them away. Once the adult knows they're loved and knows that even this dark side is loved, then you can make some progress. And then when you get into the hurt parts, the parts themselves may believe the dodgy gospel. and you may have to undo that and undo the religious structures. Now, the part itself, I've just lost my paper. The part itself, which is grown and it has all of that, it may have a story to tell. And so sometimes once you've worked it through, some of the healings you see, once you've worked through all of these layers, this thing pops up and just starts telling you the story. Sometimes I don't have the capacity to do it, but I've had times to pop and told the story and acted out the emotion and this or that, and then it begins an integration process. That the memory island, you've undone the prickles. I view it this way, as a simplistic way. I say that we have memory islands that should be able to integrate, but we don't want them and they're covered in prickles. And for it to come back to me hurts me, and so I push it away. And the job of the work you do is to remove the prickles on the memory island so it can just go through the normal healing process. Does that sort of make sense? Now, the prickles might be because the person thinks it's a prickle, so as you undo the dodgy gospel, a number of the prickles will disappear, right? And then as you do some work on the parts, if you have to, those prickles disappear. There comes times when the whole thing just comes back and it pops up in the person and you end up with a 3-year-old, 5-year-old, 50-year-old just sitting there telling you what happened. And you just sit there and let it run and let the tape run really. Show the empathy, let it run, and then it comes to the end, and it begins the integration process. You see the person later and they, yeah, I remember that, but it's become now, which is the goal of what you're trying to do, it's become a memory they can go into, they can start anywhere in the memory. It's not like I press play and now it acts out and goes through and this is what happened to me. It's not like a tape that runs. They can stand there and say, oh yeah, that happened, and they can say, it felt bad, but they're not reliving it in real time again with all the emotion flowing. The emotion is as a memory, yes, it felt bad, but they're not being electrocuted by the emotion. They're no longer living it. You with me? So the goal, what I've tried to explain to you is that what seems like a very complex structure has a very simple fear-love switch in the brain, which then creates the memory island, and then you go into massive complexity. But when you look at the massive complexity, there's basically a simple underlying structure to it. Have I communicated that? Now, the problem you have is, one of the problems you have is if this thing has been there a long time, since the age, I've got one person who, it has been there a long time, and since they were wee little, and she's never come together, and you've almost got two distinct people, such that she has a classical two wardrobes things, but it comes down to the fact that they become aware of very not socially acceptable behaviour for their marriage or socio-economic group, and they might find their bank statements and their ATM withdrawals at certain clubs and things at certain times of the night and morning are unbelievable when they thought they were asleep, right? And then you may have a situation where they're getting involved with other partners or things that the other person doesn't know about, and then maintaining this impressive split in their being. When the adult begins to become aware of what this other one's doing, it's a very, very destabilising, very, very scary time. And your job is to demystify it and not let fear operate. It's very, very scary if a person begins to become aware that there's a whole other side of them they never knew. And when they're confronted by people telling them about phone calls or putting in front of them bank statements or photographs from the ATM camera, when they start disputing with the bank about who withdrew the money, and they've been confronted by themselves doing it, then it becomes a really scary, am I losing my mind? What's going on here? What is truth? Very disabling. Your job is to just be very sensible in it and just explain that this is quite a normal thing. The problem then comes that you may have a very, very distinct anti-God extreme over here, and you may have a very distinct, highly religious part over there. Now, it seems to be that when we dissociate like this, that we form these extremes. This is the basis of the mind control from the Chinese governments. They would take a capitalist person in the Manchurian candidate stuff, and they would promote a communist part. So they'd run the capitalist communist extreme, right? The same thing happens in SRA. They call it doppelgangers. They call it that process. So it's how we dissociate that we go into these poles, opposite. Now, if the adult who's becoming aware of the part inside them doesn't know the gospel, what hope have you got of that part ever being accepted? So that's what I'm saying. Religion in this situation is just going to promote ongoing dissociation, never mind everything we've spoken about. So the adult has to know, I'm loved, included, accepted, Jesus loves me, and that part of me is as well. And you have to begin communicating that to this part. Now, the thing I don't get about Jesus and this healing thing is I've had times when, and they've been few and far between, where I've prayed with someone and they've hit the floor and they've wriggled and shaken around as their soul sort of come back together and things have left them and they've stood up 5 minutes later healed, right? And I've gone home shaking even 4 hours later and saying, I just saw 5 years' work in 5 minutes. And then what I don't get is why then you wrestle and help and cry with and work through stuff with people, right? And then it takes years for others. I just don't have answers to that. Does anybody ever really thought about that? You know what I'm saying? And it just drives me spare sometimes. I just don't get it. I know enough about Jesus. I've had enough experience with him and the Holy Spirit to know it's all true. But what I don't get is why it doesn't run. Why it only works intermittently. Yeah.
Can I ask you just a question? Some of us work obviously a little bit more directly with people who are more extremely dissociative.
Yeah.
Some of us are just, more broken in a more ordinary way, normal way. I may have missed it while you're out, but could you just kind of do a little bit of a recap and a reconnect around the memory islands and how those dynamics at work in all of us, and maybe kind of coach us as to how we can.
Okay. Well. Okay. Memory island would be that.
I'm thinking illustrated sort of through the more normal, less.
Okay, for people who are not familiar with it, you go to for Thanksgiving dinner, and a whole bunch of emotions come up in you that you can't cope with because you've got triggers.
These happened to me this past Thanksgiving, so.
Yeah, these triggers, these islands have got triggers on it. It might be sight or smell. It might be a certain movement. It can be anything in life that you choose to link. And once, for whatever reason you've linked it, when the presence of that there, the emotion floods back. And then you spend yourself trying to keep it down. If your partner, if you know you've done something that upsets your partner, you'll become almost triggered about going near something that's going to upset them again. You with me? It won't be relaxed and, it's almost like, it's a jerk almost. Now, the way of viewing this of what happens in the brain is the brain seems to be interconnected, and what we're trying to do, if this is one of the many nodes in the brain, it's like we try and put a circle around it and not let connections come to the association. It's like we do defences to stop any associative trigger setting off this memory or this association that we can have these feelings. We have times when someone says something or someone tells a story and an emotion takes off in us that we can't control, and we feel sad and we hate it. And then people spend their time trying to push it. Instead of saying, okay, I've got this island here, instead of me trying to push it away, what I should do is learn to embrace it. learn to embrace it, learn to love myself, learn to go towards it, learn to preach the gospel to myself inside, and so over time I begin healing. But we don't want to do that. We have an avoidance of pain and a fear of pain, and so we keep pushing things away. Perfect love casts out fear. As we are no longer scared of ourselves, we begin to heal. When the conscience isn't going off, I don't have to be scared of this side of myself. When I'm no longer being woodpeckered by the conscience, you're bad, you're no good, you're hopeless, can you remember all those things you did, look what happened to you, when the woodpecker settles down, then you start being no longer scared of yourself and you move to being curious and interested. I wonder why I felt that way. Curious. Morality is removed from the situation and you move towards yourself in an inquisitive, curious fashion, or towards the client in an inquisitive, curious fashion, and then you begin to heal. Morality suspends healing. Morality, you get involved in morality, it will suspend healing. Was that okay?
Yeah, and you just said to preach the gospel to yourself. And I was just kind of, I think I understand what you mean.
Yep.
That was helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So, when we meet ourselves, do not have an obsession about either being healed, right? And do not have an obsession about healing people, right? And I think the focus, if you start there, is going to be wrong. And it's going to put you in an interesting situation. And having said, we've spoken about preaching the gospel to ourselves, preaching the gospel to creatures, right? Jesus has 2 commandments. So I help for myself and others. The law is summarized by what commandments? The law is summarized by 1, the commandments: love God, and 2, love your neighbour. Right? Now that's the law. That's not Jesus. Jesus is not against the law, but it's not Jesus. People say, oh, Jesus has given us the 2 commandments. That's the same as the 10 commandments. Honour God, His name is day. Honour your parents and everything. That's the law. Jesus gave us a new commandment. And He said, love one another as I have loved you. And I would actually argue, that what we're meant to do for ourselves and others, the primary focus we're meant to function on, is we're meant to put people in a platform of relationship and community, teaching them how to receive love. This commandment, the as, is the pivot point. If you haven't received love from Christ, you're not required to love anybody. If you haven't received love from Christ, you're not required to love anybody. Jesus says, what have you got that you did not receive? Apart from me, you can do nothing. Abide in me and I, and you bear much fruit. What is love in 1 John? Not that we loved Him, but He first loved us. It's not that we love God, but it doesn't start with us. The Christian walk doesn't start with us, it starts with Christ. Right? So, the new commandment of Christ is, I'm going to paraphrase it, let me love you. That's command. Then as you're able to let me love you, you will love one another. Let's put this into the context of internal healing. We've got to put people in structures where they can begin to let others love them, and Father, Son and Spirit love them. If possible, if the adult part of them can do that, they can then begin to extend love to other parts of themselves. The life flow doesn't start with you or me, it starts with Christ. The light shines through all things. We're all sustained by Him. We have to receive love from God. So, let me love you would be the first structure that you're trying to put in here. Now, it might be that this only happens, it depends on the partner, it might be this happens in their marriage. And you work very sensibly on picking up the circle of security, and you explain it to them and say, now, when you come back to your partner, notice how you roll over. And notice how, when you're sitting back with your partner, you've got such little intimacy and you're almost not there. You're like two frozen statues in the fridge, facing forward, not really relating to each other. Aren't we happy? And then when you leave, you don't really want to leave, and so you leave unsatisfied because you haven't had communion. You with me? Life conquers everything. Life, light, love. We focus on the positives. If you can build the positives in the adult, which is ultimately about receiving love, then you found space and they can begin to offer that. To focus on healing often means not that, because I call this a focus on healing. To me, this is a focus on healing. But when you say, if you focus on healing, to most people it means chasing darkness. It means chasing pain, chasing trauma, chasing mess. And that's just non-being anyway. There's nothing positive in that. Don't give it power. So, if you want to chase healing, I'm happy about it if you have a decent meaning attached to healing. If you say that the first commandment of Christ is to let me love you, you receive the love of Christ, you can do that for yourself, then maybe you can do that for your internal neighbours. Maybe you can do it for your internal neighbours, and maybe you can do it for your partner. That's great. It's a positive for you. And then, as you do that, there's going to be things happen and there'll be places to work. But you're doing it from a positive platform, not from a destructive platform. Some people, if you just go back and look at this process over here on the wall, if you can see this, you know how we build our defences against our bad part? Some people consider it good therapy to race in and try and pull down the defence mechanisms. And they think, oh yeah, we've got to charge through that. We've got to get that done. We've got defences for a reason. And defences will melt in the process of love. And if you can receive love yourself, and you can get rid of the dodgy gospel, and you can change views on things, the person begins to heal. Because, as we said at the beginning, the gospel is the power of God to healing, which is salvation to all who believe. So I don't see the gospel message disconnected from healing of the internal person. I actually see them synonymous, and I see Jesus' commands, let me love you, love one another as I love you, as perfectly tied up with it. I don't see that being useful. Telling people to love God, love your neighbour, is like asking a man with a broken leg to walk on his leg. You don't do that. And so I see the whole thing, I see the gospel as being seamless in healing of the soul, but I've only got to that position after looking at years of mentally ill Christians and wondering, why do these Christians get so mentally ill when apparently they're meant to have the gospel? And so that's why I've been on the journey through the history of human thought, through the conscience, through the fallen mind, and realising that what we've been taught isn't the gospel. And we started with the four spiritual laws today, and if you want to make a dissociative person really ill, give them the 4 spiritual laws and bang it into them. It won't work. Now, I know this is very controversial in North America, right? I've seen, when you Google what is the gospel, what do you get? You get something that bears no resemblance to what I know as Father. How can any broken person heal when ultimately the thing they're trying to heal to wants to destroy them and is breathing blood and fire? Won't happen. We pivot on fear and love. It's only in the presence of love that we heal. Okay, any questions?
Is that like religious notions you had on your list? It's mainly the big bad God.
The religious structures I had on the list are all the stuff I've been teaching today, which are the false religious structures, which is the false gospel of the abyss, the separation, the conscience-based religion, and the climbing back to God.
But it all feels.
Yeah. Yeah. Question?
In therapy, and I'm assuming in medicine and also in pastoring, one of the foundational rules seems to be stay detached or maintain boundaries. And if what we're thinking of with this model is primarily love and relational, what do you do with those two?
Yeah, well, it has been, the question was that we're taught to be detached in therapy and pastoral counselling, and through detachment, a bit like the detached scientific observer, that we're meant to then participate in healing the person. Well, the first thing is there is no such thing as the detached scientific observer. Science has dealt with that. Quantum physics, there is no such thing as detachment. As you look at the molecules, they alter to be what you want to be. You cannot be detached in the universe. So it's a joke to think you can be detached at a human interpersonal level with someone in the room without influencing them anyway. The problem with forming, there's plenty of people who would argue that their role as a therapist is to be a correct attachment model, that they're meant to be a safe, secure place for the person coming in, and while it's not quite reparenting, in some cases it approaches that, and they help redo the attachment structures of the person so the person knows how to manage. And so some therapists would focus on, as the person comes into the room and they're both agreed on it, the person learns to be open to the counsellor and this and that, and experience some sense of union and communion with the counsellor and leave. That requires counsellors with good boundaries and can become a very interesting situation cross-gender, and people can get themselves in all sorts of trouble. But I don't see any other way going forward. I actually believe there has to be some connectivity for a person to heal. I don't believe people heal in therapist offices unless there is some sense of relationship and community occurring. Yep, that's just a personal view. I've looked at some of the research on effective forms of therapy and different modes of therapy, and it's interesting it was a therapist that came out as the most important factor, rather than the style of therapy, yeah.
I think too, sometimes we assume that boundary equals detachment, and actually what happens in the context of the office is boundary creates a secure environment.
Okay, so for the tape, she was just saying some people assume that boundaries equals detachment, but she's saying that in a decent relationship you have decent boundaries. Yep. And that provides a secure environment for the person to experience love because there are boundaries. It's interesting, you look at some of the broken people and abandoned people, the moment they form a close tie with somebody, they want to sleep with them, right? So they find it impossible to work with someone closely, be friends with someone closely without just sliding into the ultimate intimate expression. Yeah. Any more questions? I think we're done, guys. It's a bit late, I'm sorry. We've pushed through pretty hard the last half. I would have liked to spend the whole day on the last half. But the point is, I know that unless you undo the first half, you actually can't hear the last half. And I've just been there, and I've tried doing the last half with people, and they missed it. So, thank you very much.